in the third week of the series titled Epic, and we are looking at what it takes to live a story worth telling. In week 1, we saw how living a story is unavoidable, but living a story that matters must be intentional. Then last week, we pulled back the reins and said, but wait, there's a bigger picture. There's a bigger story, God's story, and that our story is a part of His story. And now this week, we're going to be talking about the fact that epic stories have epic characters. Now, as I mentioned in week 1, I love a good story, especially stories that are action-packed. Because being a guy, it's all about the excitement of the events unfolding in the story. The fighting, the car chases, the bravery that goes on. And I would have to say, my favorite action-packed movie is The Patriot. Because in that story, we see a man named Benjamin Martin, who has this adventurous life, who served his country, a man who then wanted to live a peaceful life, but was forced back into the spotlight of war when tragedy struck his family and his nation. We see a man who rose to the challenge of taking on an army that was out to change his way of life. We see a man who was victorious, not because he was a proud, arrogant man, but a humble, respectable man of character, and that is why I love this story. So the question I have for you this week is, what kind of character are you? Who have you become in your part of the story? Well, tonight, I want to help you unpackage the type of character you have become so that you can get a better idea of the type of character you should or could be. So let me give you a great illustration of another great character so that we can establish the baseline or the standard of what it means to be a good character. Now see, one day, here's the story. Jesus was talking with a group of people that were very diverse. Some of the people were there, they were religious. They were the people that you thought Jesus would have really connected and got along with. Then, on the other side, the others were a group of sinners. Now, these guys loved to come and hear Jesus preach. They loved to hear Him teach. But this time, Jesus had a story for them that would illustrate a great point about God's love and God's purpose. Now, you may or you may not be familiar with the story, but it's the story of the prodigal son. So if you will, look with me at Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11. A man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, "I want my share of your estate now before you die." So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, the younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there he wasted all of his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into the field to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to eat. But no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, "At home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as your hired servant.' So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned both against heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son.'" I love the next part because this is the very nature of Jesus. Listen to what he says. "But his father said to the servant, 'Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found. So let the party begin.'" What a story about forgiveness and love. But what makes this story so unique and captivating are the characters. See, the father in this story was an awesome character. He gave his son his inheritance even before he should have gotten it. Then, after things got rough for the son, the father accepted him back into his home. See, the father longed for a relationship with his son and was joyful to see that he had returned. He could have easily told his son he wasn't welcome in his home anymore, but instead, he forgave and he celebrated. He set the standard. The father lived out the example of an epic character because epic stories have epic characters. Let me ask you a question. In the story about the prodigal son, as good as the story is, Do you know what Jesus wanted for those people who were standing around him to understand? He wanted them to understand that the lost can be found, and that those who were far from God could know him and could come into a relationship with him. He wanted them to let God rescue their hearts, their minds, and their souls. He wanted to fix the story they were living and help them be the characters that would live an epic life in an epic story. See, Jesus knew that listening to the story didn't guarantee that any change would take place in their hearts or in their minds. And the same is true for you as well. It's only when you experience God's presence personally that true change happens in your life. So Jesus, within a couple of months of telling this story, did what only Jesus could do. He gave it his all. That's right, he gave up his life. He was brutally beaten and tortured. Then he died on a cross so that freedom from sin could be possible and that change could happen in the lives of people like you and people like me. Hear what John has to say about what God did for you and me. It's John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, so that whoever believes in him will not perish, but will have eternal life." God sent his Son into the world not to judge the world, but to save the world through him. Why would God do this? Why would God decide to send his Son to earth to feel the pain that mankind felt, to experience the loss that mankind experiences, to die a gruesome, brutal death on the cross? Because his love for you is greater than anything that you could ever imagine. His love for you was so great that sacrificing his Son was the only way that you could experience God's story. It was the only way that you could be the character God designed for you to be in his story. Because until you experience who God really is, until you understand the sacrifice God made for you, you will never own an authentic faith. You will never see the big picture of God's story, and you will never be the character God has created you to be. And what we, your Switch leaders, want is for you to experience God, to understand who God really is. So tonight, I want to leave you with one principle and one question that I want you to spend some time processing. The principle is this: God can be trusted. He will do all he has promised to do. I want you to say it with me. You ready? God can be trusted. He will do all he has promised to do. And the question that I have for you is this: what type of character have you become? Are you a character who exemplifies God's story and adds to it in a positive way? Or are you a character who takes away from God's story and is only concerned about your story? So you have a decision, and you've got to decide.